Hey, everybody, and welcome to Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. Today's guest is Dr. Ashley Gearhardt. She is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Michigan, and today we are going to talk about the science of food addiction. Please welcome Dr. Gearhardt to the show. I'm so excited to meet you because I've heard about you for years, so I'm very honored to
Oh,
get to talk to you.
well, it is my pleasure to speak with you. I'm so excited that you're promoting these topics and getting them out there for such a wide audience. I know it's such a challenge to navigate the really toxic food environment that we're in. So it's so lovely to have advocates like you who are out there supporting us.
Well, I love this topic because I feel like I am a food addict, even though I've been in recovery for many years. But so many people still don't believe in food addiction, and I don't know if it's because it's a bad the word they don't like, or even doctors, even medical doctors, they think. So tell me about how you got
Yeah.
into it.
Absolutely. I started actually as an alcohol addiction researcher. And that's been a nice way to start was really getting to know the mechanisms of addiction and what triggers addiction and the way we traditionally understand it. But at the same time, I was in grad school doing that work on alcohol addiction. I got very interested in some animal model work and neuroimaging work of the brain showing these really striking parallels between overeating and what we typically see as what's driving addiction to addictive substances. So I decided to pivot and really say, well, where does this lie? To what degree um, is there something related to addiction really going on? And this obesity pandemic around the globe, where are the boundaries? How true is it? How not true is it? And I guess I have to be honest, like I didn't really think it was maybe going to really work out that way. I was like, well, maybe it's got a little bit of an addiction or it can't be that bad or maybe it's true, maybe it's not. And the more I've done this work, the more I realize that the addictive properties of these junk foods are in many ways more challenging than addictions to other substances like alcohol or cocaine or tobacco because they're so in your face and they're everywhere and they're cheap and they're accessible and they're convenient and we all have to eat. So you could stay out of the bar, right? You're not going to see heroin advertised on every corner, but you are with these foods. You have to go into the grocery store, you have to go into the restaurant, and so it's harder to avoid and harder to manage. So once I started to pivot to, asking that question about addiction and how it plays a role with food, I never looked back. It just felt so essential to me. And I just really continue to want to dive into that and study it and understand it more and more and more.
Do you think maybe the reason the people that have a problem with food addiction have a problem with it is the name? Because, you technically can't be addicted to food and eating, but I think you can certainly be addicted to particular foods.
That's an excellent point. And so I would say, I feel like there's a couple things to me that I've seen. I see there's different camps where there's controversy. One, when I first started doing the work, I felt like the way that people understand addiction, I think they think about someone who's maybe addicted to an illicit drug that's illegal, that is intoxicating, that causes overdose, and that people can't operate in society when they have an addiction easily to something like heroin or cocaine or alcohol. And, so if you think of that in your mind, that addiction looks like someone, who's breaking the law and they can't function and they're high all the time, then thinking about food and junk food really seems kind of like a wild, it doesn't fit. But once we kind of think about things like tobacco, right, that really caused us to rethink the entire field of addiction because you don't get high. It's not intoxicating. It's cheap, relatively cheap. It's legal. It's easily accessible. You can go about your day to day life doing, especially before Clean Air Acts and things like that, you, dosing yourself with nicotine all day. And yet it is the most deadly of all the addictive drugs. If we had to say, what is the biggest killer of all the addictive drugs, it's tobacco far and away. So I think that's kind of what started it a little bit, that when people would compare it to something like heroin or cocaine or even alcohol, it seemed like a far stretch. But when you start to think about tobacco, the parallels really become more clear. The second, I think, debate is exactly what you're saying, is that when we first started doing this work, I didn't feel like the research was out there that we could stand firmly and say, we know it's this type of food, that it's definitely this type of food and not this type of food. And so to be general at that point, because we didn't have the science to kind of narrow it down, we just said food addiction. But if you look at all of our measures, we specifically prime with what is, highly processed junk foods that have refined carbohydrates added, that have fats added, that are often amplified with salt. And so even when we were saying food addiction, we really meant, the sort of highly processed junk foods. That's really the addiction. Now, surprisingly, I think what's kind of interesting is there's actually been a new controversy that's kind of popped up of people saying, no, it's actually not about certain foods. It's actually the act of eating that's addicting you. So kind of it is more any food. It's just the act of eating. It's just the behavior of eating. And there's kind of this eating addiction camp. And that's kind of a newer controversy. It's one that I often have a lot of debates about and don't support. I think it's very clear that based on the research that we do, that the addictive behavior around food is very, very centrally focused on these highly processed junk foods that are altered and designed to hook you in a way that's much like what we see with other addictive drugs.
Yeah.
So, when we talk about it in my lab right now, we often refer to it as highly processed food addiction. There's still a little bit of debate. It's tricky about like, well, should we say ultra processed or highly processed or refined or hyper palatable? I think the exact term there's still debate about. But I think when we dig down to it, when we think about what kind of foods are hooking people, like we all know what we're talking about, right? We all know it's kind of ice cream and chocolate and potato chips and french fries and these foods that are altered to be hyper rewarding because they have these high levels of refined carbs and fats and amplified often with sodium and other flavor enhancers. So I'll refer to it here as highly processed foods, but that kind of parallels ultra processed and some of those other terms that are out there.
Well, that makes sense because I really don't know anybody that binges on broccoli or has to attend Arugula Anonymous meetings.
Exactly. That's what I say. I mean, it's one of those common sense things. Like when I'm giving a talk, I'm just like, it's kind of surprising that one of like my most cited papers is a paper that we did to say, kind of what foods are there that we know people have a tendency to eat addictively. And by that, I mean kind of lose control, continue to consume it, even though they're having negative consequences, have these extreme cravings. When they try and cut down on it, they feel irritable and agitated, that kind of whole cluster of behaviors. But when we ask people, what foods are you having a tendency to experience this with, nobody like if it was a minimally processed food, and by that I mean kind of a fruit, a veggie, a lean meat, a legume, right? People just were not experiencing this with like black beans and kale and like even foods that we all really like and that are super tasty, like watermelon and strawberry. That people we really like these foods, but even though we really like them, we don't have a tendency to have this addictive, binge, compulsive response with them. In contrast, people will say sometimes like, some of these ultra processed, highly processed junk foods that I eat, I won't even like the taste of them. Like sometimes they're stale or they're not as great as I thought they were going to be once I start eating them. But once I start eating them, I just can't stop. And it's all those foods that have been altered and processed in a way that really mimics how we create all the drugs of abuse in our society.
Right. Do you think it's so much the food, Dr. Gearhardt, or all the sugar, fat, and salt that these manufacturers are adding? Because on the Yale food
Yeah.
addiction scale, when you list the foods to check that you have problems with, like you see broccoli, you see pizza, but pasta's there, for example. And I don't know
Yeah.
anybody that like boils pasta and just eats it plain that has a problem with it. But then they put the jarred tomato sauce on, which has a ton of salt and a ton of
Yeah.
sugar. I mean, I don't know why I heard that there's more sugar in a half a cup of commercial tomato sauce than in 2 Oreo cookies, for example.
Yeah. There's so much sneakiness and those foods that we buy, the kind of ultra processed foods off the shelf. So much sugar. Sugar is such a cheap way to get people to want more of your product, and especially even if it's subtle, even if you don't exactly like with the pasta sauce, you don't think of it as a sweet food. The sugar is still effective that's in it, activating reward regions and showing desire. Now, I'd say we haven't kind of gotten to the point per se where we've explicitly uncoupled and said, this is the exact ingredient in the food that is most addictive. I think I certainly have my suspicion that it's highly refined carbohydrates. Because the pasta is maybe less likely to occur. I think once you have the pasta and then you add the butter and then you add the salt and then you add the cheese, it amplifies it. But I'm somebody who's treated people with binge eating disorder and bulimia, and you'll see that people will take white bread, right? Like that's just this refined carbohydrate without butter or without, and just will eat like a whole loaf of very refined flour kind of based carbohydrates, which then, when it gets into your system, creates a very demonstrative blood sugar spike in the same way as, sugar on its own. So when I think of it, if I had to pick what I see as the most likely candidate, it's rapidly absorbed refined carbohydrates. I think fat really amplifies that and kind of hits this whole other pathway of reward and desire in the brain that kind of amplifies the effect of the refined carbohydrates. And then it's further amplified by salt and then other flavor enhancers. I think one thing that often doesn't get talked about as much when we think about these foods, but that as from an addiction perspective, I think is really key, is the speed in which the rewarding ingredient is delivered to your system. And so if you think about something that we know of as addictive, like a stimulant, if you take it in a way where you take it really quickly and it gets to the brain really rapidly, like you snort some cocaine, I mean, it's really rapid and you get this like quick fix and then it crashes. If you take that same stimulant kind of active ingredient, but you set it up so it's kind of a low, slow release into the system, it's low and slow, then you have, medications for ADHD. It's not as prone to be addictive. It can be a therapeutic. Similarly with nicotine, if you smoke it, really rapidly hits the system. If you have it as a nicotine patch, the reason people don't get addicted to their nicotine patches is because it's this low and slow delivery of that addictive ingredient into the body. And when we think about these foods, they're really delivering this powerfully reinforcing hit of, high energy ingredients like these refined carbohydrates, but in a way that's much more rapid than getting sugar from like a banana or getting sugar, from a handful of fruit. Like the dose is lower in the fruit. You don't have as much, carbohydrate, but also it has water and it has fiber and it has things that make it harder to eat. Think about like a handful of Skittles, how quickly it is to have this completely refined food that's just kind of just so dense sugar. You can eat it so rapidly and get such a quick fix. There's nothing to really slow down its absorption into your system. And then it's already been kind of pre-processed and pre-texturized, so you don't have to chew it that much, right? It's just like it just melts in your mouth and then it hits your system more rapidly, covers the tongue more rapidly. So these foods, not only do they have unnaturally high levels of these rewarding ingredients, but then they're designed and engineered in a way that they deliver those rewarding ingredients in such a rapid way. And that is really key in determining how addictive something is.
Is that because it releases dopamine more quickly or releases more dopamine?
Yes, that's exactly. So what we think the mechanism there is that, when we look at like kind of the different profile of dopamine release, the kind of reward motivation neurotransmitter in the brain, is that that kind of rapid spike in it is much more related to an addictive profile than something that might lead kind of a low and slow release of dopamine. That spike and then that crash that leaves you wanting more, when you get that, it's the amplitude, like how big that dopamine spike is, can play a really key role in whether something's prone to addict you.
That's so interesting. You developed the Yale Food Addiction Scale,
Yeah,
correct? And,
correct.
and so I have it pulled up on the computer. I might have some questions on it, but for
Sure.
people that don't know, what is it and what led you to develop it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, when I first started doing this work, and I wanted to dive into this question of, is there such a thing as an addiction phenotype in the consumption of these foods? Are there people out there who are experiencing this addictive phenotype, this like cluster of behaviors? I realized like we didn't have any way to measure it. And we were kind of asking, we were either using obesity as a proxy for an addiction to these foods. Or we were asking people to kind of self-identify as a carb craver or a chocoholic. And so I really wanted to say, how do we define if somebody comes into my office and I want to understand whether or not they have an addiction to alcohol or whether they're just a social drinker, right? What are the questions I ask? And I realize there's, this certain level, certain key diagnostic criteria that we agree upon as a field that we ask for all addictive substances to try and diagnose someone as having an addiction or not. And so I was like, it seems to me, if we want to say how similar is this to these addictions to things like alcohol and nicotine and cocaine, we should use those same criteria. And so in the Yale Food Addiction Scale, I took those diagnostic criteria that had been designed for other substances and applied it to the consumption of those highly processed junk foods. And that includes things like diminished control over consumption, not being able to cut down, even though you're having really negative consequences, extremely strong cravings, things like tolerance that you feel like you're needing to eat more and more to get the reward that you're kind of craving, withdrawal, that when you try and cut down, you experience things like irritability and headaches and agitation. And so this kind of whole clusters of different symptoms. And so that's what the Yale Food Addiction Scale is. And we think that's been important because while we do see that there is a strong association between this addictive eating profile and obesity, it's not a one-to-one. It's about, 4 times higher, the food addiction threshold, in individuals who have obesity versus those who don't. But not everyone who does have obesity does seem to have this addictive phenotype. There's so many different pathways. We can think of medication side effects or genetic anomalies or different ways that people can have a BMI over 30 that doesn't necessarily reflect this addictive phenotype. We also see that for some people, they might have a normal body mass index. So you might look at them and not know that they have this addictive response to food because they either are young and have a really high metabolism, or they're purging, or they're aggressively exercising. And so I think you can't necessarily look at somebody's body weight and shape and think you automatically know what their relationship with food is. And I think the Yale Food Addiction Scale helps us dig into that a little bit more precisely.
Yeah. Well, I consider myself a food addict in recovery. I used to be close to 200 pounds, but I follow an abstinent-based program. And I mean, I don't feel like it's restrictive or anything like that. But so when I take your test today, it's not accurate because I avoid those foods. You know what I mean?
Totally.
Yeah. So we have about 70% of Americans overweight now. I think it's over 40% of obese. What percentage of them do you think are experiencing a food addiction?
Yeah, so our research finds that it's about 1 in 3 or 1 in 4, or what? Yeah, it's like 1 in 3 or it's usually about 30, around 35% or so of individuals with obesity meet for the food addiction profile. If we start looking at individuals who have obesity who are also binge eating, then it goes up to about 60%. And one of the things that I think is really key is that doesn't mean that addiction isn't playing a role. All right, so this is a little tricky. So I'm going to try and lay it out. I think there's 2 questions to be had with the sort of research we do. One is, does a person meet a threshold where they look like they have a clinically significant and impairing compulsive behavioral pattern with food that reflects addiction? But on the other hand, the question is, are these highly processed foods addictive? And you can have negative consequences related to an addictive substance, even if you don't have a full-blown clinical disorder. So think about alcohol, right? Many people, 90% of people drink alcohol. Only about 14% of people meet for an alcohol use disorder, kind of on that spectrum of alcohol addiction. But it's the 3rd leading cause of preventable death. And this is mostly due to people who are showing kind of that subclinical response. You drink a little bit more than you know you should, a little bit more than is safe, a little bit more to the point where your risk for breast cancer goes up, a little bit more to the point where your liver is struggling. But you may not look like somebody who has an alcohol addiction who needs treatment, for that alcohol addiction. I think if these foods are addictive, which I think the evidence is growing and growing to suggest that they are, that for most people, you're going to struggle. You're going to have enough of an addictive pull from these foods that you're going to eat an extra 200, 300, 400 calories a day in a way that might be kind of mindless. Like you don't even realize you're doing it. And then that is going to have you gain weight and be more prone to diet related disease over time, even if you don't meet for full blown clinical YFAS food addiction. Does that make sense? And so I think there's this misunderstanding. Like there's this amazing study that came out that Kevin Hall did, where he took people who weren't risky eaters per se, kind of average Americans, weren't necessarily food addicts or binge eaters, and he had them live at the National Institute of Health. And for 2 weeks, all the foods they had available to them were ultra processed foods. And 2 weeks, all the foods they had available to them were minimally processed, unprocessed foods. The same people ate 500 more calories a day on when they were living in that ultra processed food environment. And they didn't report it was because they were hungrier. They didn't report feeling out of control. They didn't report binging. It was just that those foods have like enough of a pull that we're just prone to overeat them more. We eat them faster. They don't signal our satiety signals as rapidly. And so like, so I think one of the most important questions here is a both question. We need to understand when there's people who have a full-blown kind of addiction profile with these foods who need treatment and assistance and clinical levels of care, while understanding that even if you don't have a full-blown kind of compulsive addiction, if our environment is dominated by addictive foods that have enough of a pull that you find yourself going back into the kitchen, to have one more cookie or, a couple more handfuls of potato chips, but it doesn't feel super out of control, it might be the addictive pull of that food that's bringing you back for more. And then when you try and quit because you're pre-diabetic or you're having, heart disease, you might find that you're unable to do so because you're hooked on those foods. So that's the way I kind of think about it.
Yeah. So failure to cut back, in other words.
Exactly. That I think for a lot of people, they maybe don't really understand how much they've gotten hooked on those foods until they hit a point where they try and cut down or try and cut back because there's a health concern or something comes up. And then it's kind of like what we saw with cigarettes, right? That like it didn't seem like a big deal. People could go about their life, but once the societal understanding of how unhealthy and how damaging for your longevity cigarettes were. And then people tried to cut back and they couldn't, that most people failed. Then it became really clear that this was something that was hooking people and addicting them.
Right. Well, the DSM-5 criterion for substance abuse disorder, I think isn't it something like unintended use, failure to cut back, cravings, and use despite knowledge of consequences. If we take that into consideration, don't you think many more people would meet the criterion of at least a moderate addiction?
Yeah, it's, so we use those criteria on the food addiction scale. And one of the things that we kind of do is that we think about and generally we think of mental health struggles and addiction struggles all on a spectrum, you know? And so, like, again, if you kind of think of alcohol, uh, there's people that, maybe every once in a while, once a month, they drink more. They said they're going to go out for happy hour. They said they're going to have one drink. They end up having five. The next day, they have a headache and they don't feel great, and they have some cravings for alcohol, but it's an occasional thing. Now, are they still having that addictive pull to alcohol? Yes, probably. But are they at the level where we would diagnose them as having, a clinical a clinical level of needing treatment, alcohol use disorder? Probably not. And so I think one of the things we do with the Yale Food Addiction Scale that we don't do with the DSM right now is we kind of provide two ways of scoring it. One is just on this kind of continuum, whether you want to label yourself as like a food addict or not, how many symptoms are you experiencing, right? Like, are you experiencing loss of control regularly? Are you experiencing inability to cut down regularly? Are you experiencing really extreme cravings regularly? And in that, we see that, the more symptoms you're experiencing, the more likely you are to have a whole host of issues, including obesity and diet-related disease. We then also have this black and white cutoff that mirrors the DSM that says like, are you at a clinically significant and impaired level where we would say you require treatment? This is like pretty severe and extreme. So like we really need to classify you. Now what we see is about 15% of Americans meet that full-blown diagnostic level. That's the exact same amount pretty much that we see with alcohol. And so it's, I think when you can still think of this as that, I think for most of us, and this, our research bears this out, that the average American is experiencing one or two symptoms of addictive eating in response to these foods. The average American is experiencing symptoms of addiction. That's just typical in our food environment. Now, there might be a smaller subset that end up in that really severe, like, clinical full blown category, but there's a ton of harm when the average American is experiencing, on a daily basis in our kind of, our current society, an addictive response to these foods. That's a lot of harm and struggle and difficulty trying to manage a healthy relationship with food.
Do you have a program where you work where you treat food addiction, or do you individually treat people?
Yeah.
And what is the treatment? I mean, from me, from my
Oh,
perspective, the
man,
treatment
man.
is abstinence.
Yeah, no, this is such an excellent question. And I would say that's really one of the things I was actually working this morning on, like my 5-year plan. Like, okay, I'm like coming out of maternity leave. I just had another little boy, and I'm like, what's next? Like, what do we need to do next? I would say that in general, that is one of the next big frontiers is um, more scientific evaluation of what helps people who have this addictive response. I don't currently have a clinic right now, but I am in the process of developing a treatment manual that we're just getting ready to test. And I am actually hoping in the next year or two to start treating individuals, seeing groups of people to test out our manual to see if how much it helps people. And I would say that, one of the things what I see right now when people ask me, what should I do? Is, there are treatments out there that use a cognitive behavioral therapy approach for binge eating disorder. And that a lot of those approaches are very similar to what we do with addictive disorders. It asks you to try and understand your triggers, understand what triggers your cravings, develop alternative ways to regulate your emotions, helps you kind of think about where are your risky situations, helps kind of with some of the low self-esteem issues that can make one prone to it. And so there's lots of that. And that can be helpful. And for some people, that works great. But one of the big mantras with CBT for binge eating disorder is like there's no good food and there's no bad food. It's not about the food, it's about how you relate to them. And I think that doesn't actually mesh up with what we see in the research. There is something about these foods. They're engineered and designed to be hard to manage, to hook you. So the food industry makes more money. And so on the other extreme, there is abstinence-based Food Addicts Anonymous and Overeaters Anonymous programs, which I know from so many people have found like the only way they could find sanity with their food. I know that it's been, there hasn't been like as much scientific evaluation of those programs from doing like a randomized kind of controlled trial sort of approach. And I think something like that would be very beneficial for the kind of 12-step community. Because I would say, in general, what I hear in the scientific world is that there's a lot of concern about kind of the abstinence focus, because I think in part people don't really know what that means. And I, to be honest, I don't fully know what that means. I think people picture then if you do the abstinence based program, that means you're only surviving on like kale and like bran. And that's not what it is. The more I learn about it, the more I realize that it's a much more flexible and personalized and thoughtful and tailored approach to what works for you to bring sanity with food, with a big focus on kind of minimally processed, unprocessed food consumption. I would say that that community, one of the best things they could do is try and get researchers interested in doing randomized controlled trials with Overeaters Anonymous, Food Addicts Anonymous, comparing it to control conditions and showing that it helps people feel better and it doesn't lead to restrictive eating disorders. That's the concern I hear a lot about in the field about that approach. And so I think that sort of research would be really powerful. I've also, when I think about what I'm kind of brainstorming about in my own perspective from a treatment direction, is this idea of harm reduction. And so for some people, when we think of something like alcohol, For some people, like abstinence is like the only approach, right? But there's actually a subset of individuals with alcohol and marijuana who show an addiction to it, where you're able to allow for moderate use with some alcohol containing products in some low risk situations. And that's an empirically, scientifically supported treatment for alcohol and for cannabis. And I'm curious whether something like that might apply to the way that we relate to these foods, and whether, there might be this subset of foods that just are too risky, like double chocolate chunk ice cream. And that's just something that you do abstain from. It's not something you can eat safely. But maybe there's more moderate risk foods for you, like something like maybe a Kind bar, that it is a more processed food, but for some people it might not be as triggering as something like the double chocolate chunk ice cream. And so are there ways that there might be some flexibility around some of those foods to broaden the diet, that they can be consumed in low risk situations, like when you're with safe people, or when you're not hungry, or you're not eating for boredom reasons or emotional reasons? I don't know yet. I really don't know. So we'll have to test it out. But I think that's my take home on this. I think when it comes to treatment, we are hitting this point where it's really clear that for this addictive phenotype, we need a specialized treatment. We can't just use our same old, I think, cognitive behavioral treatment for binge eating disorder or things like that. It's just not maybe fully capturing it, but we need to be able to have science to help really guide what's the best approach, and for whom is certain approach better or potentially risky, or what, we kind of maybe want to match certain treatments to certain people's strengths or their desires or their profiles. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, it seems that people have to know themselves, and this is not a one
Exactly.
size fits all, and that it exists on a continuum. But for somebody that is known to be a hardcore alcoholic, cutting down on drinking does not help. And so I think for a certain population, my mentor, Dr. Alan Goldhammer, who's the co-author of The Pleasure Trap, says
Yeah.
that because something is less bad doesn't mean it's good. And we don't have to consume refined carbohydrates. We don't have to consume sugar, flour, and alcohol to thrive, to be healthy. And I find that when for me, that's what I mean by an abstinent-based program,
Yeah.
because I don't resonate with the 12-step programs or the food addiction programs, because they insist, well, first of all, I don't like to say that I'm powerless. And that to
Yeah.
me
Yeah.
I don't resonate with that type of thinking. But also they insist that you weigh and measure your food on the plate for your rest of your life. And the program I teach is ad libitum, following the
Yeah.
principles of Dr. Barbara Rolls at Penn State
Yep.
University, calorie density. So I don't feel like I'm in a restrictive eating plan, because I
Yeah.
eat as much as I want whenever I want, but I just don't include refined carbohydrates like sugar, flour, and alcohol. And
Yeah.
I can eat whatever I want. I eat huge quantities of salads, potatoes, rice, beans. Yes, and it does include kale, but I don't sit there and eat kale all day. I'm eating sweet
Yeah.
potatoes. And I mean, I'm also a chef, so my food is really,
Yeah.
really good. So yeah, I find this is really interesting, but I also find that, at least with the people I work with, the environment is very critical to their
Oh,
recovery.
100%. I think you're so right. And I guess that's like where I'm at. And I really like hearing your perspective on this, is that I do agree for some people, we just don't have the science yet to know for whom or what. But I think, your instincts, that someone who's having this very severe addictive like response to these foods, one of the things we often think about is, we talk about when we talk about this research is like quality over quantity. You know what I mean? It's like what I hear from you, Chef AJ, is that you pay a lot of attention to the quality of kind of unprocessed foods. And I think that that is kind of foundational for all like for people who are struggling with this, that's the number one foundation, is like quality, kind of minimally processed foods. Some people, the same way we see with alcohol, might not be ready or be motivated, or it doesn't fit with their lifestyle to say, I'm going to give up all of these foods. And so I do think there is an opportunity that I've seen with treating people with alcohol and cannabis use disorders, that you can maybe match some people in this more moderation approach, but I think it's not for everybody, and so I think that more research needs to be done to really help us figure that out, and to provide people with guidance on what's going to work best for their lifestyle and what's going to help them have the most healthy relationship with food. But you bring it to the environment, and when I think about what is the number one factor that is keeping people trapped, it's that we're surrounded by all the foods that are most prone to trigger an addictive response. That's what's cheap, that's what's accessible, that's what's convenient, that's what's subsidized by our government. That's what's targeted towards children. That's what, if you're poor or if you're poor, often communities of color, they don't have access to the foods that actually benefit survival and our health and nutrition. Like, I think I found some stuff that is just blows my mind, that you can look at the same grocery chain, and if you look at it in an affluent neighborhood relative to looking at the same grocery chain, but in a poor neighborhood, the grocery store in the poor neighborhood will have more ultra processed junk foods. And they will advertise and push ultra processed junk foods more on the days that people get government assistance and are able to buy food if they don't have enough money to eat. And so the environmental burden that we all hold, where we're having to constantly, it takes effort to kind of make sure that we're protecting ourselves against an environment that encourages this addictive eating profile. It is not what we want to encourage the health of ourselves and our children and our future generations. And it's particularly unfair that the groups that are holding the biggest burden of this, who are most set up to fail, are our most vulnerable communities.
Well, speaking of vulnerable people, let's talk about children for a minute.
Yeah.
Does how early you're exposed to these foods make a difference? And does the mother's diet before pregnancy have any effect on the child's future with these addictive substances? Because I keep thinking about these videos I see on TikTok,
Yeah.
like smash cakes, and I'm thinking that is
Yeah.
the worst idea ever, because
Yeah.
a kid at 1 year old doesn't, like, it could be shaving cream. It's about it could be mashed potatoes. Why are
Yeah.
they doing this?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think our research there is, it's what's so interesting is how far I often feel like the research is, behind what we kind of have a common sense knowledge that, yeah, the idea, we certainly see that this addictive phenotype that we see in adults, absolutely we see it in adolescents and in children. And if we think about what are the foods that kids and adolescents are struggling with this in the addictive way, it's the same foods that adults do, right? These like very ultra processed foods. There's research out there that actually does, when we look at it in relationship to obesity, that the current generations, like younger generations, are struggling more with obesity because they were exposed to this really high added sugar environment earlier in their lifetime, when their brains are more vulnerable, when their emotional strategies and inhibitory strategies are less developed. And so when you get exposed to it earlier in life, and that's the dominant kind of food environment that you have, there is evidence that that is setting these generations up to fail more and more and more. And that there is evidence out there, especially in animal models, where still there's starting to be some evidence in the context of humans, but we definitely see in animals that if the mother is on a very, kind of high sugar, high added fat diet, that alters reward related neural structures in the brain of the offspring and makes them more prone to have preferences for those same sorts of foods and to binge on them. Now, translating that to humans, I'd say it's always harder to control, but there is some evidence that that similar kind of poor diet quality and these like ultra processed junk foods, a diet kind of dominated by that, when a woman, when she's pregnant, is related to at least kind of childhood, the infant's weight. I think what we haven't done is follow the kids long enough to see whether it predicts whether they start to consume in an addictive like way themselves when they're 6, 7, 8, or in adolescence. But it certainly, from the animal models, is highly plausible. And I think, again, it goes back to that social justice issue of, if we think about certain moms, we all need calories. If the only source of calories you have is ultra processed junk foods in your environment, again, we're setting certain groups of our society up to fail, and for their children to potentially be more vulnerable as well, because our food environment is so messed up.
Yeah. Well, do you think the processed food industry will ever be held accountable in the way that the tobacco industry finally was held accountable with lung cancer?
Yeah, I do. I really do feel hopeful about that. And I'm actually reading this book. It's by David Kessler, when he was the FDA, the head of the FDA, when they were holding tobacco accountable. And it's interesting reading that. It's called a Question of Intent. It's really a good book. And he was talking about, like, reading that about like the 80s and 90s and how much people felt completely hopeless that we were ever going to be able to hold tobacco accountable because they were so powerful and they had so much money and they were tied in with agriculture and it was like a powerful cash crop. And to see them fighting the good fight and being successful on the other end gives me hope. And I think that some of the things that's specific about food that gives me hope is that we do all have to eat. And I think some of the um, deceptive practices, the targeting of vulnerable children, the manipulation of these foods, this isn't something that only affects a subsection of the society who smokes, right? Like with tobacco, it was affecting smokers, and then, there was secondhand smoke. We all have to eat and we all have to get our calories. And so if these foods are addictive and they're now the majority source of calories in the Western food environment, this impacts every single one of us. And so I think at some point, and we're just seeing that the public health burden of diet related disease associated with these foods is becoming so huge that we can't afford to not to just sweep it under the rug. It isn't the minority of our population that's struggling with it, it's the majority. And so I am hopeful that we just won't be able to keep giving the food industry a pass.
Yeah, I hope so. Do you
Thank
think
you.
that there's a difference between food addiction, compulsive eating, and emotional eating? Because the people I know that say they suffer from these things, like I say, they're not eating like me. They're not eating whole, natural,
Yeah.
unprocessed food without tons of sugar, fat, and salt added.
Yeah, no. So, I think when you say all those three labels, food addiction, compulsive eating, and emotional eating, yeah, I completely agree. The thing that holds those three together is the foods that are the focus of those behaviors are all, it's the foods we think have an addictive profile. Like nobody's like, I've had such a bad day, I'm so emotional, I'm going to sit down and eat a bowl of salad. Like it's a bowl of ice cream, right? There's the reason that these foods are the focus of it. Now, I think the two that seem like maybe most synonymous to me is like compulsive eating and food addiction. Like what is at the heart and the key of addiction is a compulsive response, right? Where you can't quit down and you want to, but you can't. And you're returning to it compulsively. The compulsivity is, I think, really part and parcel to what addiction means. So those two things seem very synonymous. I think emotional eaters, it could be the same thing. It also could possibly be, depending on the severity level, someone who is further down that dimension of showing some of that addictive response, but maybe they haven't hit, a point yet where it's like a full-blown addiction. So I think of people, again, I always kind of go back to alcohol, right? Some people will, like, if they've had a really bad day, will be prone to like be more prone to have a drink that night. Or if they're bored, will be prone to drink. Now, one of the things we know is that, drinking, using addictive substances to cope with negative emotions is one of the riskier profiles for going on to develop a full-blown addiction. And so if that person wasn't kind of, showing other signs in their eating behavior, but was just kind of in that zone of using these foods to, occasionally cope with their negative emotions, I would warn them that they may be at risk for starting to go further and further down that path if there aren't ways that they kind of find a way to regulate their emotions with things other than these foods.
But we didn't seem to have these conditions before processed food existed. I mean, that was most of human history.
Yeah, yeah, you're very right that, like, it's you if you don't have the foods, like if you waved a magic wand and these foods went away, right? You wouldn't they wouldn't be the unprocessed, minimally processed foods that we have available to us. They just wouldn't be as effective, right? And if you're having a super bad day, like, it's funny, actually eating an apple might actually make you feel better in a more holistic, longer term way than eating that bowl of ice cream, but it doesn't give that same like intense, rapid reward hit. And so at the end of the day, it does to me come back to the food. I think when you look back through history, you look at countries now where their food environment, like China and India, where our ultra processed foods from the West have gotten exported, the rates and the level of this kind of out of control emotional eating, diet related disease, high, overweight, obesity rates are tied so closely to those foods entering the environment. So if you had to pick what is the biggest contributor to that, it's certainly the way these foods have been processed and altered, that just takes, what we're evolutionarily designed to want calories, and so it's using our evolution and the what was designed to help us get enough calories to survive, and it's using it against us, and it's setting us up to fail, and our health, both physical and mental, to struggle. So yeah, the food at the end of it is really, really key.
Yeah. Well, that's why I tell people, if it's in your house, it's in your mouth. Just stop buying the crap. It's not good for you. It's not good for your family. Nobody needs to eat processed food.
And it's one of the things I think I've seen that's been one of the major obstacles for people I've talked to or people I've treated in the past, where like one person in the household, it maybe has that relationship, but they don't care about it. Like there are some people absolutely who can keep potato chips and cookies in their house and they don't have a tendency to have that addictive pull. They're the minority, certainly they do exist, but that's not the average person, and here. And what I've seen is that if in families where there's a mismatch, where like one person has that addictive pull and the other doesn't, um, or one child has that pull and the other doesn't, that can be a really tricky obstacle to navigate for people. I've seen where they'll kind of feel like, well, I don't want to punish my partner by not having these foods in the house, and yet like we'll often flip it on its head, that if one person was having was struggling with alcoholism and the other wasn't, the danger associated with the alcoholism, how severe that would be, you would get the alcohol out of the house if that was what supported the other person's recovery and their health.
Yeah.
And so when we come to this eating, I think because people are, will be skeptical, even if they're seeing someone they love really struggle, that dominant narrative that's, oh, it's just about willpower and people just have to try harder, is so blaming and shaming and not helpful. But that's where people will like stay and not change their own personal food environment, which is one of like at your own home, what's in your car, what's in your office. That's one of the areas you have more control. Whereas you can't help necessarily what advertisement comes on TV, or that the fact that there's a fast food restaurant advertised at every stop on the highway, but your own home, you can set it up to optimize, what foods nourish you and which foods are beneficial. That should be the default in your home. And if there's a food that you're finding you're constantly struggling with, having to like clamp down the willpower to not constantly go back and overeat it, then you're really that's a food that to try and keep in your house is just setting you up to fail. Because as soon as you're tired or you're stressed or you're bored or you're just mindless for one moment, the food is designed for you to mindlessly and compulsively overeat it.
Yeah, thank you. There's nothing that infuriates me more than these spouses that say, well, you just need to have some more control or willpower. And yeah, I always would assume that you would support a loved one in recovery. It's like you gave the example of what if one child is susceptible, one isn't. If you had two children and one had to use a wheelchair, you would have a wheelchair ramp. You wouldn't say, well, sorry, he can walk, so you got to figure it out. I mean, to me, that is
Yeah.
completely insensitive. And these spouses that do that, that's like saying to somebody that's an alcoholic, well, you need to have more self-control. You need to just push yourself away from the bar. And this is why I do these interviews and do this work, because it infuriates me, the degree of ignorance in people that just don't support those in recovery by not only not allowing them to have a clean environment, but intentionally eat these hyper palatable foods in front of it. To me, that's spouse abuse. And I just wish there was somebody with enough, I don't know what the word I'm looking for, to just really read them the riot act and how destructive their behavior is to their so-called loved ones.
And I think, one of the thought process I have is like, as the research is getting out there more, like a new book just came out. I haven't read it yet, but I talked with Michael Moss a lot when he was writing it, the book Hooked. And Michael Massa is just a really powerful journalist who's won a Pulitzer Prize and covered tobacco. He has this other book, Sugar, Fat, Salt. And so he is really, I think, trying to get the message out there too, and podcasts like this about these foods and how they hook us. Because his first book, he said Sugar, Fat, Salt was on like how these foods are bad for us. But if all you say is like these foods are bad for you, and you don't take the next step to say, well, why are people continuing to eat these foods? Then it's like, well, you know it's bad for you. Why aren't you stopping? Right. In the same way that's with tobacco or alcohol. It's like, oh, you know it's bad for you. Why aren't you stopping? Well, if you take it a step further and say, well, these foods are actually engineered to hook you, to alter reward and motivation systems in a way that drives forward continued compulsive consumption. And that given that we're in a society that has not made that message clear, and we've had a food industry that has pushed often in collaboration with government agencies like the USDA, that it's not about the food, it's just about the way you relate to it, and it's just about exercise, and it's only about willpower, but like nothing about the foods. Like that's the message that is the dominant message in our society right now. And so I'm hoping that over time, as we start to understand more about the consequences and the very intentional process that goes into creating and designing these foods, it will help us have more empathy and compassion for people who are struggling with it. And rather than kind of blaming and shaming them, holding industries that are making billions of dollars profiting off of people's struggle to consume foods in a healthy way. That like we have to pivot, this accountability, to hold the individuals who are profiting off of making this environment where people struggle. And to me, it's just like how Suboxone, or not Suboxone, oxycodone, when like the new opioids came out on the market, and after very little evaluation, they said, oh, they're not addictive. And then they pushed them and they pushed them through doctors, and they just said these are not addictive, there's no risk, get them out there, prescribe as much as you can, gave incentives to doctors to prescribe them as much as they could. And then when it became clear that these were highly addictive, and there were people that were getting hooked and just really fueling a whole opioid epidemic all over the United States and tons of death, that they doubled down on, it's not our product, it's just this subset of bad people who are addicts and criminals, and they're just bad people. And so don't hold us accountable. Like, don't regulate our product that we're creating and pushing. Blame these people. And so we've seen this playbook time and time and time again, with every addictive substance under the sun, which is to blame and shame the people who are struggling rather than to hold the industry that's profiting from it accountable for their role.
Wow, thank you. So your research revealed that when people cut back on eating highly processed foods, they experience withdrawal type symptoms similar to those in drug addicted people who try to kick drugs or nicotine or marijuana.
Yeah,
Doesn't that say
absolutely.
something about the addictiveness of the product?
Absolutely. It's, that's something that is a very big passion of mine right now, is really diving into that more and more. So, we've seen in the animal models, repeatedly, that like, especially with sugar is very powerful in being able to trigger withdrawal. That when you take the sugar away, or you give animals the sugar, but you also block the rewarding effects of the sugar in the brain, that the animal will look like it has withdrawal from something like amphetamines or alcohol, like with shaking and teeth chattering and aggression and big stress responses. And this is again where like the science is so far behind the people of like, when you look like anecdotally, like people will tell you, I have had withdrawal, right? Like when I tried to cut down on sugar, when I tried to cut down refined carbs, I was irritable and fatigued. My cravings were out of control. I had headaches. I felt depressed. And it popped up. The first week or two were really awful, but if I could make it through that, it would start to get better. But no one believed them. Like, I can't tell you how much like I've seen before I started doing this work, like just a complete dismissal on the idea that there could be this withdrawal syndrome. And again, I think it's like people thinking that withdrawal looks like withdrawal from opioids or alcohol, which is very physical, where it's like people vomit and they sweat profusely and they can die physically from the effects of the withdrawal with something like alcohol. But for many drugs like cocaine and cannabis and things like that, the withdrawal syndrome is more it's more about this kind of psychological irritability and cravings and depression, and it's not as dominated by physical symptoms. And those psychological symptoms are actually more aversive and more predictive of relapse for many people, and they hang around longer. And so with this research, our research is suggesting that people are experiencing this same cascade when they try and get off food. And it's another reason why it's like, hey, just stop eating it, just quit. Well, if when you do that, then you feel depressed and irritable and your cravings flare up, and everybody's telling you that doesn't exist. That's a huge obstacle that we need to develop treatments and interventions around supporting people and educating them that, listen, if you're going to feel worse before you feel better, possibly, when you're cutting out these foods. And so I really want to get to the bottom of that, and not just for that idea of equipping people with the power of knowledge that they know what they're getting into, and interventions to help them um, get through the withdrawal and get to the other side of it. But it also gives us another tool to say, if people cut down on other sorts of even calorie dense foods like, nuts or legumes or avocados, I'm betting you, like, if you stopped eating avocados and, black beans, you're not going to go through withdrawal in the way that you are when you cut back on potato chips and, cookies. And so I think it gives us another tool to say which of these foods are most capable of triggering addictive responses, and what is it about those foods that's the best predictor of that, like, addictive response.
Right. So this concept of tolerance can apply to
Yeah.
food.
There's certainly evidence of that. And again, the animal models give us such a good tool. I mean, we just see with addictive substances, sometimes people will be real skeptical about animal model research. But when it comes to addiction, there's been just incredibly tight parallel between what you can get animals hooked to. That's what humans get hooked to. Like the reward systems are kind of so parallel. And so we do see that when you start giving an animal where you can kind of have total control, like over their diet and what they're eating, that when they start binging on the sugar, the binges get progressively larger and larger and larger over time. And that corresponds to changes in the reward system that is really suggesting that they're getting more and more and more tolerant to the effects. So they need these bigger binges to get the same reward effect. And humans, it's been a little trickier because we get such early exposure to these sorts of foods. So you almost need to look at, like, tolerance and how quickly it develops in the first few years of life. Because once you get to somebody who's even in their 20s, you have 18-year history of exposure to these sorts of addictive foods. It'd be interesting with someone like you, Chef AJ, who, like, has given up these foods for a long time, to put you back on these foods and see what happens over time. Does it start to, I bet if you first ate it, you'd be like, oh my gosh, like, that's so intense. And then after a while, you would probably adapt. But it feels, I don't want to ask anyone who's been eating that healthfully to say, hey, go back on this. It's too hard to, like, get yourself
I
back.
wouldn't do it. I don't think I'd
No,
do it for $1 million, because
no.
my food sobriety and my calmness and, having been obese for over 50 years, I wouldn't trade that for anything. But I'm pretty sure, like you said, the first
Yeah.
bite, I'd be like, this is disgusting, but I would
Yeah.
still have that pull. I mean, I was the person that drank a Coke Slurpee for breakfast with 8
Wow.
pumps of vanilla syrup every single day, many
Wow.
times a day. So there's no way I would go back there. And that's what I wanted to ask you about
Yeah.
liquid calories, because you had mentioned
Oh, yeah.
sometimes the speed at which it's absorbed plays a role, and so many people like myself in the past are drinking so much soda. I mean,
Yeah.
I see kids at Costco 2 years old from a sippy cup, the mother's pouring the $1.50 pizza soda thing, and that
Yeah.
can't be good.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's so many things about liquid calories that are bad, and they certainly are this just kind of rapid shot of sugar into the system. Plus caffeine, we know caffeine has so much about it that, you get tolerant to it and you have withdrawal from it. So when you combine the sugar and the caffeine and all the enhancers in it, it really just seems like tailor made to hook people.
Yeah. You did a study in 2019 with I'm sorry, the name is Schultz or
Oh,
Schulte. You found, I think it was a 50% prevalence of food addiction using the Yale food addiction scale in the overweight or obese population.
yeah.
That's a lot, right?
Yeah, 100%. And, I think especially when we're talking with individuals who also experience, kind of a binge sort of response. Bulimia nervosa is actually one of the samples that we see is most prevalent. In some studies, up to 97% of people who have a diagnosis of bulimia are also meeting for this kind of addiction food phenotype. So it's definitely like even when we think about this full blown clinical syndrome, it's not a tiny portion of people. Like it's quite notable. It's the same prevalence as something like alcohol use disorder. And then when we just look at something like how many symptoms is the average person in America having, almost no one on our scale says they're not having any symptoms. Like 0 is a very rare response. So even if you're not having that full blown experience, you might still be experiencing signs of an addictive pull to these foods that can damage your health over time.
I actually pulled up this. I'm not a doctor, but I did pull up the study and read it, and it said the conclusion was that food addiction appears to represent a distinct phenotype within overweight and obesity, marked by greater emotion, dysregulation, impulsivity, and cravings, which have been observed in prior studies examining features of individuals with addictive disorders. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I think that sums that up perfectly. And it just that idea of, some of what we're seeing there and why if you're treating a group, if you're treating obesity and you're not addressing that, at least for a subset of individuals who are coming to see you, it might be marked by this addictive pull and this addictive phenotype. You're going to be missing the mark, and there for that group of people, possibly by just kind of just saying eat this and not that, and not addressing some of that pull and the compulsiveness and the dysregulation. And I just saw there was a study that I didn't do, but a group did. It was one of the largest weight loss treatment trials that has been done, called Diet Fits. And what they found was that they looked at every kind of psychosocial predictor they could of age and race and impulsivity and all sorts of things. And the number one, the best predictor of who was going to fail to respond to traditional weight loss treatment trials was the Yale Food Addiction Scale. So this suggests, again, from this kind of very practical, like why should you care perspective if you're a treatment provider, is that this might be telling you, even if you don't believe in food addiction, this might be telling you a subset of individuals who are not going to respond to the traditional treatments as effectively, and that we need to tailor treatments to more address their experience with these foods.
So what about all these fake sugars that have 0 calories, like
Yeah.
stevia and aspartame or erythritol? I see people turning to them, but I think those are addictive too, because they
Yeah.
give the sweet taste without the calorie reward, and I hear that those are actually worse for people.
Yeah, I would say there hasn't been specific science yet that's like specifically disentangled that in humans. In animal models, they have done work with artificial sweeteners. Nicole Avena, if you haven't talked to Nicole Avena, she's a great
I
person.
have her on schedule for, I think
Great.
she has a new book coming out, What to Eat If
Oh,
You
that's
Want to Get
exciting.
Pregnant. She's either next week or the week after.
Awesome. Oh, that's great. She's fantastic. And you can add like a lot of her animal model research that she was doing was finding that that it was actually with those artificial sweeteners and looking at the sweet taste and the power of that, and that it was showing very similar, in some cases stronger addictive changes in the brains of those animals. And then there's some suggestion that like it through it may prime kind of the body to expect to get calories. And then if it never gets it, then it might kind of keep you in this idling state where your body's ready for calories that it hasn't gotten, and might set you up to be prone to overeating. So it's certainly a very powerful sweet taste. And I certainly approach it with skepticism of that it would be a treatment or a panacea or not come with some additional negative consequences for somebody who's showing this like addictive response to these foods.
Yeah,
And
and
often it's tucked into other processed foods. And so, like, as we've been kind of talking about, it might keep your taste buds and your brain used to this certain level of like extreme, unnaturally intense chemical sweet taste. And it kind of can prevent you from readapting to the pleasure and the sweetness of naturally occurring foods like fruits.
exactly. Then I know I see people, they think they're doing a good thing because they walk around with these little bottles of processed stevia and they got to put it in their water, and then they can't enjoy a strawberry.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, right. And also here, it's not very good for our microbiome, these artificial.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that research is just so on the cutting edge. And there was a study that came out recently finding that food addiction was associated with an altered microbiome in a way that's, not benefiting health. And our gut and our brain talk to each other so much. So if there's struggles going on in the gut, it can't be good for the brain either.
Right, because I recently hosted a GI health summit, and a lot of doctors were saying in this area of food addiction, it's almost like the microbiome is
Yeah.
addicted to the junk and is going to
Yeah.
make you eat it because and now it has to have it just to survive.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yep. That makes a lot of sense.
yeah. So what role, if any, does exercise play on addiction,
Yeah.
food addiction specifically?
So I think exercise is, I think there's some really exciting work out there as exercise is kind of like an alternative reinforcer when you're in recovery. So for addictions broadly, that especially there's some evidence that cardio exercise can kind of help the reward system of the brain um, kind of regenerate itself and recover. And so I think about it, exercise I always try and hold that, one of the industry's favorite narratives is that, overweight and obesity is just an issue of physical activity. And it's very clear that that is not the case. That if you had to pick one, diet or exercise, that diet is the dominant factor here. Um, with exercise, we do see that it can get to this point where people find it rewarding and reinforcing. And so when you're trying to replace the artificially high level of stimulation you've been getting from these highly processed foods, if people can start to find enjoyment and reward in their exercise, um, it can be a reinforcer to replace those unhealthy foods with, and can kind of help the reward system of the brain kind of recover in a way that makes it kind of less dependent on these foods. That exercise actually maybe seems to reduce kind of the degree of reward responsivity that these foods trigger in the brain. So I certainly think it can play a very helpful, beneficial kind of additive role in helping people recover.
Man, it's kind of hard to binge when you're like running.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. And I think that is important too, that like people find exercise as much as they can that they enjoy. I think this idea like going and be like, okay, I gotta go and I gotta do this thing. And even though I hate it, I hate running, I'm gonna force myself to run 20 miles. That especially if you're just getting started in an exercise program, like finding things that are enjoyable, that you like, that give you a sense of happiness and reward are going to help you be more able to stick with it. And so thinking about what that is for you, rather than being like, okay, I have to punish my body to burn X amount of calories, kind of really reframing it as something that's more holistically important for your mental and physical well-being, and what you enjoy and what you feel good doing to move your body.
I often find that people get into careers because maybe they had this affliction or a family member, but you didn't, right? This was just kind of
Yeah, I would say like I definitely in my family history can look back for sure. And so I think it, resonated with me. My one grandfather really, really struggled with Pepsi. Like I mean, he would drink just 2 liters a day. He had gout from it at one point, and it was something that his entire life was just something he struggled with, despite having kind of that strong desire and urge and drive, and he wanted to quit all the time. And I think he quit and relapsed at least dozens of times. That I saw, it was like a very clear struggle. And like all of us in this society, I find it challenging to navigate an environment, especially a mom of 2 young kids, and my husband and I work full time, and so it's stressful. And you can feel the pull of these foods, and how it's more convenient and our environment is set up to make that be our default. And then it takes that extra effort and energy to try and set up a food environment for myself and my family that encourages, kind of this healthier, holistic eating pattern.
yeah. Well, great. Well, thank you so much for the
My
work you do.
pleasure.
I find it fascinating. I'd love to talk to you another time, perhaps for one of the
Absolutely.
comments. And is there a way for people to follow you or find out what you're doing?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm not super active on social media. Another thing I think is like mildly addictive, but also has lots of good benefits too. And the best way to kind of keep track of me, I would say, is my Fast Lab website. It's in my little bio. And if you go to my website for my food addiction science and treatment lab, you can see all the papers that we're publishing and talks. We'll link to this, Chef AJ. So if you don't mind sending me a link to this, we'll put it up on the website as well. And you can see talks I've given in the past and kind of keep up to date on some of the coverage of our lab.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and
Yeah.
congratulations on having another little one.
Thank you so much. He's a cute little guy.
Well, great. Thank you. And thanks to all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. Please come back tomorrow at 11 a.m. Pacific time, the regular time. I'll be speaking with Dr. Joe Weiss about colon cancer prevention. Thanks again, Dr. Gearhardt. It was
Thank
fascinating.
you. Bye.